1 or 2 weeks ago, you listened to my predictions for the top 10 at the end of 2025 for the ATP. And now you're going to listen to my slam predictions. I know it's a bit late, the season has already started, but my predictions had been kind of set in stone earlier anyway. So we'll go over them now. For each of the 4 slams, I'm going to give you a surprise run, which means a surprise deep run from someone outside of the top 10. Then I'll give you a surprise upset from someone who either did well at the tournament before or also is a top 10 player already. And then I'll give you the final and the winner, of course. And I'll also give you maybe like a storyline or things that I can see happening. Without further ado, but by the way, with some further ado, thanks for everyone who watched the first video. It did get like 200 views, which isn't bad. It's quite nice actually. So thanks for listening. We are going to go straight into the first one, which is the Australian Open. Now the Australian Open, we got of course Jannik, the defending champion, against Daniil Medvedev. And let's start with the unseeded run that I can see happening, which, not unseeded run, but not top 10 run that I can see happening, which is Arthur Fils. I mean, he's been solid for the second half of last season. He's also getting the new season started in a nice way. So I can just see him, make a for him. I feel like an unseeded run would have to be better than a 4th round. I can see Arthur Fils making a quarterfinal and then crashing out. So that's my unseeded run. For upsets, I actually have kind of 2. One is my real pick, which is Medvedev, just because there's some pressure. He's performed too well in the past, but he is the defending finalist. And if he doesn't defend these points, he'll drop out of the top 5. And he'll also be like in arm's length for the number 7, 8, 9, 10 player to overtake him. So if he wants to avoid that, he'll have to defend a lot of points against players who he's not faring well against. Because okay, Medvedev is going to go in as the number 5, which means in the quarterfinals he'll have to either face Sinner, Zverev, Alcaraz or Fritz. Now Sinner beats Medvedev, Alcaraz is a tough matchup, Zverev is a tough matchup, and Fritz Medvedev isn't really something we've seen that often, but I feel like nowadays Fritz would do better than he did in previous matchups. Let's actually take a look at the Fritz Medvedev head-to-head. It's 1-1, and Fritz won the 2024 matchup at the ATP Finals 6-4, 6-3. So yeah, I'd go for a win for all of those 4 basically over Medvedev, which is a shame. And it's just I've said it in my ATP predictions. I don't know, the serve do be declining, or he's got issues. He's got a hurt shoulder, and that just sucks. But it is what it is. It be like that, as they say. So I think Medvedev could crash out early, and then picking Ruud on hardcourt is not really an upset for him to crash out. So that's something. I'm also going to pick Rublev as another upset. I don't know. I feel like he's already lost in Hong Kong in the round of 16, which also without this loss, if I had recorded this a few days earlier, I also would have picked Rublev, just because he's been so consistent at the slams, but last year he lost his consistency everywhere else, and either he gets more consistent everywhere else, or he also loses the consistency at the slams, and I think it will be the latter. I think he'll crash out in the 2nd or 3rd round to someone who's slightly overperforming, like a Jordan Thompson. No, he can't. Jordan Thompson would be a 3rd round matchup because he's ranked 27th. Or Pesci Perry card, right? Or something that's a bit awkward. You know, maybe a Bublik, a Nakashima, Mikkelsen. Someone like that I can see taking out Rublev. Now, what do I have as the final? For the final, I have Jannik Sinner defending his Australian Open and defeating Zverev in the final. Now, why do I have those two? As the other two semi-finalists, I'm going with the gut feeling and saying it's going to be Alcaraz and Djokovic. And if again, this is going to be a storyline because if the draw shakes out differently, then these matchups in the semifinals won't happen the way I predict them to, or the way I can see them happening. But I feel like we might get a rematch between Sinner and Djokovic, and Sinner is going to beat Djokovic, not as clearly as last year, but he's going to beat him in the semifinals in 4-5 sets, and Zverev is going to beat Alcaraz in the semifinals in 4-5 sets as well, and then Sinner is beating Zverev in 3 or 4 sets in the final. Just because Djokovic, of course, now coming in with a new coach in Andy Murray, so I feel like he really wants to win this tournament, but I just feel like Sinner is still too strong on hard court. And even if he makes half a step backwards, he still would be too strong for current Djokovic, or Zverev or Alcaraz, or basically anyone. The only way I could see Sinner losing at the Australian Open, if he really, either gets sick, gets hurt, or really underperforms, like really makes 1.5 steps back and goes back towards the Sinner of like late 2023, who was still very, very good. That was the start of his like rise, but he was still, he could be beaten. Like at the ATP Finals 2023, Djokovic beat Sinner in the finals. So back then he could be beaten on hard court, which really wasn't the case. Other possible matchups: if Djokovic gets Zverev, Djokovic wins and goes to the final, for example, and Sinner versus Alcaraz at the Australian Open. A big what if, in my opinion. Because Alcaraz has had Sinner's number, but I feel like the matches have been so close that Sinner is due a victory. And if Alcaraz makes the final, I would back Alcaraz to win against anyone because he hasn't lost a major final. He's just so good in the big finals. And if Zverev makes the final, I bet him, I think he'll lose as long as his opponent is either Sinner or Alcaraz in the final. Again, Alcaraz in the semi-final, different thing than Alcaraz in the final. If he gets a Djokovic, he also loses. If he gets an oddball like a Tsitsipas, or who has also been performing very well at the Australian Open, by the way. If he gets like a Tsitsipas, which is just the volume just a bit. If he gets like a Tsitsipas, or even a Medvedev, or for some reason a Ruud or a Rublev or something like that, or someone outside of the top 10 even, then I can see Zverev winning. But against the big leagues who already have multiple majors, I see him losing. So yeah, it's of course going to depend on the matchups that we will get, because there's a lot of like rock, paper, scissors situations going on in the current top tier with the current top tier players. Like Alcaraz always beats Sinner, Sinner always beats Medvedev, stuff like this. Fritz always beats Zverev. I don't know, that's the one I'm going for. But you will see full detailed predictions once the draw comes out, which I will do basically the moment we get the full draw with the qualifiers placed. I feel like I will wait until the qualifiers are placed, or if it's too late to do that for time reasons and stuff like that, then I'll just take a look at the qualifiers and take a look at who's dangerous there. We also should talk about Taylor Fritz. I feel like he'll still be consistent, but I don't know. I don't like his chances at the Australian Open that much. feel like his chances at the US Open or even at Wimbledon are a bit better, because there's just a lot of players that are peaking at the Australian Open that maybe wouldn't be an issue otherwise. Like Tsitsipas always performing well there, Medvedev always performing well there, and Fritz is someone who stays healthy throughout the whole season and then at the end really clinches some clutch victories. But I feel like early in the season, with everyone coming in strongly from the off season, I feel like Fritz isn't quite there. So yeah, that's why I'm not picking Fritz to go into the semis, for example, but like 4th round or quarterfinal for Fritz. Moving on to the French Open. First up, the surprise deep run is, in my book, someone you know quite well already. Namely where do we have him? Where are you? Are you hiding? There he is. Namely the current top 150 player, Joao Fonseca. He's currently in the semi-final of an outdoor hardcourt challenger. I mean, he's been performing well on indoor hardcourts and outdoor hardcourts, but he is a clay courter, and by that time frame, I feel like he'll be well within the top 100. And if he doesn't get a horrible draw, I feel like he can make a 3rd or 4th round at least, which would be the run for him that I count as like a deep run for someone coming in as like an 18-year-old, right? And then he'll probably crash out to a good player. Because again, if you're unseeded, you're going to have to play good players quite early on, and that's the reason why I'm not picking Joao, Jesus fucking Christ, to go further here. Is it Joao or Joao? I'm just gonna say Fonseca. I think that's easier. And for the final, I should mention upsets. I've got Tsitsipas here. I also have Rublev again. And I think that's about it. Those are my upsets. Yeah, there's not that many top clay courters. And also Novak Djokovic, just because I feel like, I don't even know if he's going to play the clay season. Is he going to try and go for a 4th French Open? It's the most painful one to win because you're going to be on court for so long. And I feel like he might skip it and go for Wimbledon instead. So either I don't know, I feel like if he gives it his all, French Open is possible, a win is possible. But if I were him, I would maybe skip. I don't know, I feel like going for Wimbledon and the Australian Open is more important at this point. But yeah, Djokovic, big question mark. I mean, Medvedev is also on the upset list, but he's not. He's only Medvedev like twice in his life, for basically. So I don't expect him to perform well at the French Open ever. And for the final, I do have Carlos Alcaraz, a repeat of last year. Carlos Alcaraz defeating Alexander Zverev in the French Open final, which means Zverev now would have 4 Grand Slam final losses. And Alcaraz would clinch his 5th slam. And in the semi-finals, I'll go for another Sinner. And I'll go for a Casper Ruud. I feel like those are quite likely. Those have been strong in past years. Just Sinner versus Zverev on clay court, I'm not too sure about. And Sinner versus Alcaraz, we've seen last year was quite close. But normally Alcaraz is just better on clay courts and should beat Sinner. And Ruud, I feel like, doesn't have much of a chance against Alcaraz or Zverev on clay court. And also against Sinner, I see Sinner ahead. So even if those were to meet up in the semifinals, then I would see Sinner in the final. And if he gets, for some reason, Zverev, Sinner wins again against Zverev. And if he gets Alcaraz, Alcaraz beats Sinner in the final. But for now, I'm going with Alcaraz defeats Zverev in the final. Moving on to Wimbledon. Unseeded run, or like a not top 10 run, would be Matteo Berrettini. He's one of the best players at Wimbledon we've seen in the last 10 years, and this is not hyperbole. He's just been a bit fucked by the draw, and he hasn't been able to. Let's actually take a look-see here. He's got a 14-5 record at Wimbledon. Now let's take a look at his losses. 2018 to Gilles Simon, he wasn't really developed. 4th round in 2019 against Roger Federer. Then in 2021, in the final against Djokovic. In 2023, in the 4th round against eventual champion Carlos Alcaraz. And in 2024, against Jannik Sinner, who came in as the #1 player in 4 sets again. If Matteo Berrettini has a good clay season, he'll have a decent enough seed. I feel like if he gets into the, let's say, top 16, then he might be able to avoid some of the harder players to play against. Upset alert. Yeah, basically, what would be a good run for Berrettini? Well, until he either meets Sinner, Alcaraz, or Djokovic, or until he gets to the semifinals. That's what I'm predicting for Berrettini. Upset alert for a lot of players in the top 10, actually. Alexander Zverev, never performed well there. Casper Ruud, probably just going to skip altogether. Is he even playing Wimbledon? Or is he or he's losing in the 2nd round? And also, let's go for Tsitsipas, because he's also not good here. So yeah, those are my upset alerts. What's my final? My final is Novak Djokovic defeating Jannik Sinner in the final to clinch his 25th victory. What's the storyline here, you might ask? Because there's an absence of Carlos Alcaraz. I feel like Carlos Alcaraz is due to lose again at Wimbledon, because a 3-peat would be incredible. But I don't know, I feel like this year he had like a 5-setter against Tiafoe where he managed to kind of wiggle himself out of trouble. And I feel like this year he might have a similar match in a 3rd or 4th round and just lose. Like one of those freak upsets he sometimes suffers. And I feel like this will be the case in Wimbledon this year. If he doesn't get upset until the semis, he wins it again. That's what I'm saying. If he gets like semifinals, he gets like Fritz. Okay, he beats Fritz. No, he can't get Fritz if the seeds hold until then. Okay, and when we're at Wimbledon, he'll already be the #2 player, I feel like. So he'll either get Zverev or Fritz. So in the semifinals, if he meets one of those, he'll beat them, because Zverev won't even be there because he'll crash out in the 3rd round. And Fritz is just not as good as Alcaraz, especially on grass. And again, if Alcaraz makes it to the finals, he almost always wins. Yeah, and Sinner, you know, he was hurt against Medvedev in the quarterfinals last year, lost a very tight match, and I feel like if he comes in healthy, he's going to make the final. But Djokovic made the final last year while being unhealthy and hurt for the entire tournament, and then was whooped in the final. But I feel like he'll give it his all to get the 25th major, and I feel like he'll just do it. I don't know, I got Djokovic over Sinner, with the asterisk of Alcaraz having an upset loss. The other two, the semi-finalists, if you will, I'm going to go with Berrettini, and I'm going to go with Taylor Fritz. I feel like Taylor is still solid enough on the grass, but he's not going to beat any of the other semi-finalists. Now, if we switch those around and Djokovic plays Sinner in the semis, I think it might get closer, but Djokovic still beats Sinner and then beats whoever survives from the Fritz-Berrettini matchup, which I think would be Berrettini. So if those two meet, so if the draw shakes out that way, I feel like Djokovic will have another 4-set victory over Berrettini at the Slam final, and if Djokovic has to play Sinner in the final, it will be another 4-5-set victory for Djokovic. If Djokovic somehow plays Alcaraz because he doesn't get upset and he stays as consistent as he has been, then I have Alcaraz winning again in 4 sets this time around. So yeah, but I'm going with Djokovic over Sinner for Wimbledon. And then at the US Open, as a deep run from someone outside of the top 10, it's an easy one for the US Open. It's always gonna be Frances Tiafoe, because he's been so good. I think he's been to the quarterfinals for the last 4 years, and you always like this year I was like, maybe he's not going to perform this well this year. No, he just turns it up. He turns into a top 5 guy at the US Open. That's just, or at least top 8 guy at the US Open. And that late into the year, this is worth a lot. So yeah, Frances Tiafoe overperforming again, or like not overperforming, but finally performing to the extent we know he can. And on upset alert, I mean Ruud. Then I'm also going to pick Djokovic again, because if he's got Wimbledon, I feel like he'll be satiated for the year. And if he doesn't have Wimbledon and doesn't have the Australian Open either, I feel like he's not going to perform well at the US Open either. Tsitsipas is going to crash out. He's horrible at the US Open. Yeah, also kind of on upset alert, Jack Draper. I have him in my year-end top 10, but he's got semi-final points to defend, so I think he'll be much more consistent at the other tournaments, like maybe a quarterfinal at the Australian Open and a quarterfinal at Wimbledon and like a second round at the French Open, which would already be great for Draper. But I feel like he might have like a 3rd or 4th round loss at the US Open next year or this year. Yeah, and I don't have the semifinals yet. You know what? Okay, I've trusted Fritz to stay in the top 4 until the end of the year. So what I'm going to do is, for semifinal 1, we have Jannik Sinner defeating Daniil Medvedev. And for semifinal 2, we have Carlos Alcaraz defeating Taylor Fritz. And in the final, we have Jannik Sinner defeating Carlos Alcaraz in a legendary 5-setter. So while I would have Alcaraz defeating Sinner at Wimbledon and defeating Sinner at the French Open if they meet, and maybe even defeat Sinner at the Australian Open, what makes it different at the US Open is it's so late into the season. Normally Alcaraz just hasn't been performing that well late into the season, except 2022, where he of course won the US Open. But like in the last 2 years, he really hasn't been that great, and that's actually like a huge lie. Like, he made the semifinals in 2023, but he had his upset loss in 2024. He's going to get into it with a vengeance, with a lot of points to make up. He's going to stay super focused, but Sinner at the US Open, I just don't see getting beaten. So we've got Sinner over Zverev at the Australian Open. We've got Alcaraz over Zverev at the French Open. We've got Djokovic over Sinner at Wimbledon and Sinner over Alcaraz at the US Open. Zverev, by the way, after the French Open, will not perform well at Wimbledon and will also not perform that well at the US Open, I feel like. I feel like having 2 major final losses will hurt him more. Yeah. So those are my predictions. For the US Open, if the draw shakes out differently, I also have Medvedev losing to Alcaraz, and I also have Fritz losing to Sinner if my semi-final picks hold. So the final would end up being the same. And if for some reason Alcaraz and Sinner were to meet in the semis, then it's a toss-up, but I'm going with Sinner again. And if Medvedev and Fritz were to meet, I'm actually going with Fritz over Medvedev, and then we would have a repeat of last year and Sinner beating Fritz again in the final. So those are my variations of this draw that I could see pan out. And yeah, I've been actually keeping this for a nice normal length for video wise, right? That's nice. Not a 1.5 hour video. I can be quicker than that. I knew it. So yeah, let me know if you have other type of predictions in the comments. Let me know your picks from outside the top 10 that you can see have runs at different majors, and your picks from inside the top 10 that will be upset. And also let me know your winners and finalists. I've been stizzl. Yeah. And you'll see me next time when I'm going to predict the Australian Open draw, probably. Bye bye.